It's always a great pleasure and a privilege and honor for me when people invite me to talk about something that's I'm very passionate about, and something certainly that has played a significant role in my life on the practical side of things, how I consult with organizations, and then also gave me quite a bit of an entry into the world of academics. My research in this field all stem from practical challenges that I faced as a business consultant. I worked on about 17 different countries, specifically on the African continent, and that's where I experienced a lot of these challenges regarding what I call disruptive complexity or disruptive change. And I came up with a couple of thought paradigms or thinking models which really helped me, but more so help business leaders to make sense of the complexity that we find ourselves in these days, and the kind of disruptive business environment that we find ourselves in these days. So during the afternoon, I'll be sharing quite a bit of these experiences with you, and hopefully leave you with a couple of tips and some tools and guidelines that you can take back into the workplace. The first thing I want to talk about is this slide, which you normally find when you have a presentation or a learning intervention of sort, or workshop, call it what you like, where people normally share with you the learning outcomes for the afternoon. You know, what is it that you're going to learn? And you'll notice there that I decided not to focus on learning outcomes. So I say, well, there is no learning outcomes. And the reason why I specifically and purposefully chose to not have learning outcomes is I want you to think differently about things. I want you to think differently about learning. I want you to think differently about what it is that we're going to talk about this afternoon. And therefore, I did not want to choose a kind of a framework and structure to this session that maybe you are already familiar with. A large part of this afternoon is rather for you to realize a number of things that you might know already, but that you haven't quite been able to put into practice. You don't necessarily have the right model or tool or framework therefore. So I'm not going to talk about learning outcomes. I'm rather going to talk about realizations. Some of these realizations that I want to discuss with you this afternoon is the fact that we can all do extraordinary things. It's a fallacy to think that greatness in business leadership and greatness in leading in an era of complexity are only destined for a few individuals. A lot of people that we follow these days that are doing extraordinary things come from very common and simple backgrounds. I think of someone like Elon Musk, for instance, who grew up in South Africa, my home country, with his brothers, leading a very simple life as a child. And look at him today, really setting the pace, being the disruptor and creating a lot of this change that organizations are so confronted with. So that's the first thing I want us to realize. The second thing is, which is probably the most important realization of the afternoon, is that change starts with a change in our thinking. Now, why do I say that? I say that because based on how we think about things determines how we behave and how we act. I take a simple example of having lunch this afternoon. Now, the reason why I don't eat and eat and eat till I cannot eat no more during my lunch hour is because I have an assumption. And the underlying assumption is that tonight I will be having dinner. So because I know I'm going to eat tonight, there's no fear and there's no just digging into my lunch and eating as much as I can. So we have certain underlying assumptions about life that determines how we think about them, and that determines how we behave. So if we want to change the way in which we behave and how we tackle the challenges we find in today's business environment, we have to start changing the way in which we think about things. We need to and we can challenge the norm. A lot of times we find ourselves in organizations where there's a specific way of doing things, and we almost like soldiers in the military just blindly follow the way in which things are done. But we can and we should And we need to challenge the norm, how we're doing things, because we need to do things differently if we want to create and see more success in the business environment today than what is currently the case. I always say to people that in order to discover new shorelines, you have to lose sight of the existing one. I have a small boat that I play with here on the waters of Dubai, and nothing fancy, it's just I love the sea. And it's so true. I'll never be able to discover or find another shoreline unless I'm actually willing to lose sight of the one that I'm looking at. And therefore, we need to really challenge the way in which we think about things. So the way in which I want to sort of take the afternoon is to almost present it to you like a movie. You know, we're so spoiled these days with different ways of seeing movies. There's Netflix, and there's online series, and there's television programs, there's big screen movie to a lesser or more extent, depending on which part of the world you live in. But by and large, we all have the privilege of watching a movie. And I want to present this afternoon's webinar in the fashion of a movie, where first we're going to talk a little bit about the euro, and this euro is in you. The euro is in you thinking differently about things. But for that, I'm going to take the middle scene, and we're going to get to know the villain. All movies have a villain, the so-called bad guy, the bad person, the criminal. And what the bad person in a movie normally does is they steal something, or they take something, and often they kidnap someone and they hold them for ransom. So we're going to talk about this villain. What is it that in today's era of disruptive change, what has been kidnapped? And then the final scene will be, you know, how can we be saved? How can we get out of this kidnapped position that we find ourselves in? And all of this takes place in the realm of thinking. So first talking about the euro, introducing the euro, then talking about what is it that's been captured or kidnapped, and then finally, how can we be saved from that? So setting the scene is not something new really that I share with you when I say that the 21st century remains captive in unprecedented volatility, really unprecedented volatility, sweeping Jeff Immelt, CEO of GE, refers to when he talks about the business environment. And this increased intensity and pace of change. So it's not just a question that the world is changing, it's also that the pace, the tempo at which it is changing is also increasing. So it's almost like a double-edged sword. There's more change, more frequently, and it's happening faster. So this has become the reality for most organizational leaders today, and it makes it difficult, sometimes even fearful to manage and to lead our organizations, because a lot of our thought paradigm when it comes to management and leadership, the researchers and psychologists will tell you that you require a certain platform or a certain context within which to think. And if it's required that you think logically, structured, rationally, then the environment should be a stable one. It should be a calm one, a peaceful one, so that your thought paradigm is not disturbed. However, we find, if we look at the business environment of today, it's random in its change. You don't always see it coming. I remember I worked on quite a large project in Northern Africa just before the Arab Spring. And one of the deliverables that we had on this project is we had to inform or suggest to a company where they should put up their Northern Africa head office. This was a construction company, a large construction company, and there were two choices. The one was Tripoli, and the other one was in Uganda, capital of Uganda. And we did a 6-month feasibility on this and did quite an intense environmental study on both environments. And afterwards, after the 6-month period, our recommendation was Tripoli. which 6 months later fell as part of the Arab Spring. So a lot of times this change that we're talking about these days is quite random. It's fast and it's totally unpredictable. You can't always see it coming, and henceforth it makes it quite fearsome to manage in these times. It's volatile, it's extreme, in a way what I call dysfunctional. You think things are supposed to function in a certain manner, trends are supposed to take a certain direction or a certain percentage of growth, and it's seemingly just not like that. Now, the interesting thing about this volatility, this disruptiveness, this complexity that we find in the environment is a lot of the organizations that I work with, I find the leadership in terms of how they're thinking about the environment, I find the thought paradigm trapped. I find it kidnapped. This is the kidnapped part I want to talk about. And I put this picture for you to have a look at there, and I would like to know how many of you actually saw that there's no bottom to this cage. The cage is open at the bottom. Yet, while you look at the picture, you probably see a cage that's enclosed. And the first thing that goes through your mind is that this represents some form of entrapment, some form of being stuck. And the reason probably for that is you don't necessarily bother to look at all the angles. You don't consider all the different perspectives. So you see the cage and immediately you think something is entrapped. You see a little bird in there. You don't see that it's open at the bottom. And I find a lot of times when I deal with business executives, especially in today's business environment, that they're almost like that. They're almost entrapped in a way of thinking, and therefore they find the complexity in the environment quite challenging, and they find this complexity disruptive and fearful. And because of that, we find that what we call mechanistic and non-systemic success recipes to strategically manage institutions are failing. Now, what does that mean in English? What is a mechanistic and a non-systemic success recipe? For this, I briefly need to just talk about thought paradigms and the ones that we use, the frameworks that we use when we scan the environment. Most of you are probably familiar with the sequence of planning strategically. It normally starts, and it should start, with you scanning the business environment, both internally, your own organization, and also externally. So you have some kind of a reality out there that you are trying to observe. You're trying to find indicators that tells you which way trends are moving, which way growth is going. What are the popular fashions? What are the popular trends? Are people into technology? Are they into the latest fashion? What is their thinking around transport? Are they still stuck in an era of conventional transport? Or are they moving to more environmentally friendly sources of energy? You sort of look out there into the environment. Now, this looking to the environment and doing an environmental scan requires a certain framework. And this framework, for some leaders, tend to be mechanistic. It's almost a way in which you break things into smaller, manageable bits. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, because it's exactly there where the entrapment happens. If I use something like a PESTEL framework, of which I'll show you a picture a little bit later, I tend to think within those components. But what we're finding these days is that those frameworks, the mechanistic and non-systemic frameworks, a Porter's 5 forces, a PESTEL breakdown of the external environment, a conventional SWOT matrix of the organization, they tend to not necessarily yield the kind of successes that they yielded 30, 40 years ago. And the question is why? Is it in our application of these frameworks, or is it a question of a mismatch between the kind of framework that we're using and the kind of reality that we are viewing? That's the question that we need to answer. And so what we are saying is that in order to free yourself from this mechanistic thought paradigm, we need to consider the following question. Now, this is just one, ladies and gentlemen. I worked on a research project for my PhD over a period of 7 years, working with 121 different multinational organizations on the African continent. And these are one of the key questions that we uncovered during this research as to why people and why business leaders are so stuck in thought paradigms and why it's so difficult for them to manage in an era of complexity and constant change. And that is that, what is the challenge of the 21st century? What if it is better served by understanding how to think about organizations in the environment as opposed to what to think? A lot of business leaders always want to know, what should I be doing next? And what we're telling business leaders more and more is there's a more important, or there's a preceding question to that. First, you need to ask how you need to think about the environment. So the scanning of the environment is the first step to strategic planning. Only after that you can craft certain scenarios from which you then select 1 or 2 or 3 as contingent scenarios. And then you go to the planning stage and the stage of implementation. It all starts with, how am I thinking about the environment? Do I still regard the environment as something that's segmented into different blocks? A political block, an environmental block, a social block, legislative, technological block, like a pestle framework? Or do I view it more systemic, where I'm asking questions about the interrelatedness and interdependencies between these components in the environment? Really need to challenge the way in which we think about the environment. I'm going to play a small video clip, I think, that says it better than what I can. Okay, so you saw the little Apple icon there at the end. It was Steve Jobs that said that the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. So it starts with thinking. Now, I want to move your thought paradigm from one perspective to another by using the same acronym to illustrate the power of thinking differently. Most of you might be familiar with the acronym known as VUCA. It's not all that new as what people tend to make of it. It was published a number of years ago already in a peer-reviewed article from Harvard Business Review, where they spoke about the environment, and they coined this acronym known as VUCA. And in it, they describe the business environment as being volatile, hence the V, being uncertain, hence the U, being complex, hence the C, and then being ambiguous. Now, whether that is a true reflection or a true description of the environment still remains a matter of perception. But I think you will agree with me that if you are a business leader in today's times and you have to manage where the environment is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, it is a kind of a fearful environment. It almost spells all doom and gloom. The fact is, it's still based on how you see the world. You see, there's two things in our viewing of the environment. The one is called the ontological perspective. Now, I don't want to bore you with fancy academic terminology, but an ontological perspective basically means the out there perspective. So what is it? What is it that I'm looking at? And the other one is the epistemological perspective. That's the me, the eyes. How am I viewing what I'm looking at? So I can have someone looking at a glass of water that's half full, and somebody else can look at exactly the same glass of water and they'll see the glass half empty. So it's the same ontological reality. It's a glass that has water in it, but some people will see it half full and others will see it half empty. And why is that? That's because of your individual perspective. So how we think about the environment is a lot more internally settled and positioned than externally. You see, if you look, I mentioned to you earlier that I'm going to show you some frameworks, some pestle scanning frameworks. This is a fairly familiar one. It's one that I used in one of my publications. Typically, you take the environment on the outside, or the so-called outside. You have a general or macro environment, and we categorize it into a political, legal system, economic, socio-cultural, and a technological system. These kind of frameworks are quite common. There's others that look like this, where they almost represent some sort of an environmental sphere around the organization. Competitive system forces, Porter's 5 forces comes to mind, technological, political, cultural, and then the general environment systems. Now these are, up to a large extent, the cages within which business leaders today find themselves entrapped, because they still want to use these representations of the environment, whilst the environment doesn't look like that anymore. The environment is not so categorized and segmented. It becomes very difficult for us to say, there's the politics, there's the economy. Rather, what we find is that the environment is much more interrelated and interdependent. So there's a large interrelatedness between the pestle factors: political, economical, social, and technological. We all know that. Unfortunately, we have an increase in terror attacks in various parts of the world, but it remains the best example of how systemic the world has come. Whenever I want to make this point, if I have an event that takes place in London, it reverberates throughout the world. If I have an event that takes place in Mumbai, it impacts across the globe. Different nationalities, different nations are impacted by that. So none of these components in the environment are as isolated as what we tend to represent them by means of these conventional frameworks. So the first thing that we always ask business leaders is, when they look at the environment, is how are you looking at it? Not what framework are you using and what are you looking at, but how are you looking at it? And the reason why that is important is because what we see is a manifestation of what we are taught to see. And you cannot unthink or unsee things. Right? Let me make it simple by means of this little quiz or exercise that I quickly want to ask you to do and perform there where you're sitting listening to this. You have pink sheep that you are looking at right now. Now, I want you to, after you look at this pink sheep, I want you to close your eyes and I want you to try and unsee the pink sheep. And you will very quickly notice that it's not possible to unsee the pink sheep. All you now see is the pink sheep. Whilst if I play the next slide, ask you to open your eyes and I play the next slide, you see a blue cow. What you now notice is that because you're seeing the blue cow, you're no longer seeing the pink sheep anymore. So our mind has the ability to replace one framework with another. It doesn't necessarily have the ability to unsee things in their own right. And henceforth, I constantly challenge business leaders to use this acronym if you want to refer to VUCA, but let's replace it with a different perspective. Why should the world be volatile and just volatile only? Why can it not be vibrant? I find a lot of times that especially the new generation find this changing environment of us not volatile but vibrant. It excites them. And why must it be uncertain? Why can it not be unreal? Almost like challenging, almost like the youngsters of these days say, wow, it's so unreal. And why must the C just stand for complexity or complex? Why can it not be crazy in a nice way, in a positive way? And why can it not be astounding or aspiring? You see, it's exactly the same acronym that I'm using. Previously, when we spoke about VUCA, the Harvard Business Review published VUCA, it was volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Very much doom and gloom. I think you will agree with me. It's kind of fearful to do business in an environment like that. And yet, I give you exactly the same acronym, but here I say the world is vibrant, unreal, crazy, and astounding. Looking at the same thing through a different lens. So I think you'll agree with me that you would much rather want to do business in this kind of a VUCA than in the others. And that's exactly what business leaders of today are doing. Have a look at the next video. All right, the script didn't show up that nicely on the video. My apologies for that, but I think most of you would have recognized the man in the video. That's the Elon Musk I referred to earlier on, our hero in the movie, that is going to help us to escape from this kidnapped thought paradigm that we have. And I'm going to help you to do that by just highlighting some of his characteristics. This is not unique to him. This was also published in a Harvard Business Review article quite recently, of the type of leaders that you find are the ones to excel in times of complexity and disruptive change. The first one that they refer to is the so-called learning zealot. The characteristic and the skill that we talk about here really is to be constant learners and to be constant teachers. So these are people that look at the external environment with the purpose of learning, always trying to find something that they can learn from the environment, as opposed to them just being the teachers. That's the first one. The second one, which is probably my own favorite, is what is known as the personal disruptor. Now, this is a type of leader, but it's also a thought paradigm. It's the way in which you think about the world. Let me explain this slide. You see it says achieving more equals seeing less. Now what that means is that the more you are achieving things by doing things in a certain way, the less you tend to look around for different ways of doing them. And that's the entrapment that we refer to. So what happens a lot of times where we think that to know more is better, it actually limits what you can imagine. It kidnaps by means of complacency your thought paradigm. And when things then do change, you find yourself in an uncomfortable spot where it's very, very difficult for you to lead amidst that change. Elon Musk also teaches us that you can be the disruptor. You don't have to be fearful of a disruptor, but you can be the one to lead through new technology or whatever it is that you want to introduce to the market. You can create this disruption. You can be part of this complexity, as opposed to imagining that you're standing outside of it. Eager experimenter, that's the other type of leader or characteristic, as I would like to call it, of what is needed for today's leaders in this era of complexity. And that is that to fail actually excites them. They're not fearful of failing because they know from the failing comes learning. As a matter of fact, they go so far as to say that innovative leadership means I plan to fail. And I'm going to end off this webinar today by telling you or giving you an explanation of what exactly is meant by that. And then the last characteristic or type of leader would be the thought-minded optimist. So where the future is created by highly motivated people. You are the disruptor. You are the change. You invent your own future. It's that kind of a thought paradigm that runs with it. Now, how do I link these 4 leadership types and characteristics and ways in which I think? How do I link it back to VUCA? Well, simple. If I take the first one, learning zealot, I will want to learn from the environment. So if I perceive the environment to be volatile and uncertain, complex, the dark, doom and gloom, I need to ask myself, what can I learn from it? And the way in which I do that is to expand my field of observation so that I can also include positive observations, good things that are happening, which will change that view from volatile to vibrant, from uncertain to unreal, from complex to creative and to crazy, the positive kind of a perspective. Disruptor, be the disruptor. Get excited about making mistakes, because then you know that you are on the forefront of making change, of being that disruptor. Look at the Elon Musks of today. He didn't think about the electronic vehicle and then it was a success. No, there's a lot of planning, tests, a lot of failing that went into that. This is what I mean in terms of the plan to fail. And this is also one of the more significant changes that we require related to this thought paradigm shift. If you take strategic thinking and you take the specific steps of strategic thinking, leading organizations in today's business environment. I mentioned to you earlier, I start with scanning the environment, and therefore I need a specific framework. If you still want to use PESTEL or Porter's 5 forces, you can do that, but remember, you also have to include the interrelatedness and interdependencies between these components in the framework. The framework, as it was designed and developed in the 1980s, is certainly not sufficient to deal with the kind of volatile, ever-changing environment that we have today. So typically that's where I start. The second step would be to craft certain scenarios. So where's the world going? A kind of predictive modeling, looking at trends, and can I try to build a tomorrow on the basis of a yesterday, or do I need to think totally different and not so causal and consequential in terms of time? Nonetheless, I would then choose a specific scenario which would appear to be the most appropriate fit for my organization. Once I've made the selection, I'll plan and I'll put the plan in action, which is the implementation stage. Now, when you talk to business organizations, you talk to leaders, most of them, it becomes very, very evident that they plan to succeed. I mean, that's how we think. Yeah, I want to be successful. You don't plan to fail. It's almost a kind of a contradiction in terms. I come from an environment where people used to say, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. So I plan because I want to be successful. Why do I then say you have to plan for failure? Well, primarily based on practice, because so many things go wrong. You have such a large number of components that you are dependent, or a variance that you are dependent upon to work for things to be successful. So what happens is when they don't all work and you are confronted with failure, you don't have the ability to react or to respond fast enough. Let me use a simple metaphor to explain this. Most of you have probably seen movies that plays off in the olden days where cities used to have large, thick walls that was built around them, sort of protecting the towns on the inside, the small little kingdoms on the inside. And then the villains and the enemy come from the outside and they attack these small cities with a high walls with the guards, and they attack these cities or towns. And we know from having watched these movies and also reading the history is that the minute the enemy breaks through the wall, the minute the enemy breaks through the wall, they manage to either get over the wall or get in by the door, they tend to win the battle. Once they are inside the city, they tend to win the battle. Now, why is that? Well, it's a very good example of planning to succeed. So the town planners come together and they plan to build a wall with the idea and with the assumption that this wall will be impenetrable. Nobody will ever be able to get over it, under it, through it. The wall is impenetrable. And therefore, the assumption is that we don't have to teach the normal villagers, the town dwellers inside, normal people that's not soldiers. We don't have to teach them to fight. They don't have to know how to hold a sword or throw a spear or whatever, because the wall is impenetrable. Now what happens? That thought is, I'm building the wall for success. However, if I consider failure, someone around the table will say, well, what if they actually penetrate the wall? What if they break the wall? What if they come in through the gate? Let's assume they do. Well, then we have to have plan B. What's the best plan B we can have? Well, we have to have our villagers at least trained to have some form of combat skills so that they can then help in our defense because the wall has been ruptured or broken. And that's the difference between planning for success and planning to fail. There's nothing wrong in considering failure. It expands the way in which you think about your plan and also about the environment that you operate within. So, in a nutshell, very quickly to summarize, how do we lead in an era of complexity? How do we lead in an era of disruptive complexity? My recommendation from research and also from practice would be that we start by challenging the way in which we think about the environment. The reason why that is difficult is we are so entrapped in using specific frameworks, PESTLES, Porter's Five Forces, SWOT matrices. These are all frameworks which are mechanistic in their nature, unless we include looking at the interrelatedness and interdependencies between these components, between these variables. So that is what we need to change, not focusing on what we are looking at, VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and big, not taking that as a true representation of the world, but also focusing on how are we looking at the world, realizing that how we look is our view, our perspective, and a glass of water doesn't necessarily just need to be half empty, it can also be half full. So challenging these conventional frameworks that we use to scan the environment with, and coming up with more innovative ways of looking at the environment, replacing the pink sheep with the blue cow. And then as opposed to having that doom and gloom kind of a VUCA, we have a much more positive one, vibrant, unreal, crazy, and aspiring kind of a world to do business in. What are the 4 characteristics that I need as a leader? I need to be a learner and a teacher. I need to be a personal disruptor. I need to be eager to experiment and also in that sense to fail. And I need to be a tough-minded optimist. All of that should lead me to thinking differently about the business environment and challenging the way in which we conventionally plan our strategies, moving from planning for success to considering planning for failure. And that's my part of the webinar for this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for your participation. We now have time for popcorn and some questions.
Thank you very much for such a fascinating presentation. Folks, we are now open for the question-answer session. So if you have any questions, you can either put in the question box given in the end of the webinar console, or equally you could raise your hands by clicking on the hand icon available on the webinar console. So let me go straight towards the question box. Doctor, we have a question for you. There is.
Sure.
How leading retail models can drive effective self-service models?
Sorry, can you just repeat the question again? All right. I think the first thing that you need to consider is what type of retail model you are working with. When we work with retail models, there's two main distinctions that we have in retailing. The one would be fast-moving consumer goods, also known as FMCG. So those would be primarily in the food-related retail, where you're working with perishables, fresh products, and henceforth you need a different kind of a supply chain and off-shelf service for those kind of products. The other retail model that we work with would be the textile retail model, which can also be fast, but it's not necessarily, doesn't necessarily have the same kind of pressure and complexity that an FMCG have. Now, if you're looking at effective service models, probably the best example is to look at Zara in the textile industry. Because what Zara has done in the textile industry, which is an industry that you're not necessarily working with perishables, is they looked at the perishable industry, textile industry, and then they learned from that, primarily focusing on elements of service. Now, in the textile industry, one of your key service areas of delivery would be turnaround time of stock on the shelf. So how many times do I bring in fresh or latest trends of clothing? And the other one would be your speed of delivery. How fast from the catwalk to the retailer can I achieve that? So typically what Zara does, the success of their model is they work on low inventory levels and they work on high turnover in terms of their stock turns, 3 to 4, which is fairly high in the textile industry. But then where they really succeed in terms of the service model is they offer the market affordable trendiness. So they, because of the fact that they carry a very low inventory, they have a huge cost saving on their supply chain components. And therefore it's possible for them to deliver the latest trends at affordable prices. So that will be one way in which you can look at retail modeling and applying it in such a way that you can push effectiveness in terms of service modeling. When you come to self-service, in other words, we're now moving the FMCG and we're moving the textile into the digital space, there it would be a question of using innovative technology, which we find a number of companies are using, where you start to make the customer part of the production process. In other words, textile industry, small textile houses, design and fashion houses will use the consumer by means of interactive technology as contributors to specific fashion lines, and the same goes for the FMCG retail model. I hope I've answered the question.
Another one for you is, changing team culture is challenging. Which type of leadership would you recommend starting with to prepare the team for the changes ahead?
The type of team leadership style I recommend and prefer when it comes to changes in an organization is what is commonly known as service leadership. So the person that initiates the change and wants to bring about the cultural change in the organization does so through a model of service as opposed to through a model of command and lead. When people need to go through the stages of change in an organization, it is normally met right up front with quite a large amount of resistance, because none of us like to be pushed out of our comfort zones, and we are averse to change. It disrupts the working environment. We just don't like to be constantly confronted with that. So when that change is introduced through a command leadership model, it tends to have lower levels of success as opposed to being introduced through a service model, service leadership model. Trust I've answered the question.
Another one for you, that is how leaders can overcome the paralysis that characterize borders leadership.
Sorry, how can we what? Can you just repeat the question?
How leaders can overcome the paralysis that characterize borders leadership.
I'm going to need to see the. I can't hear the last word. How do I see what you're typing? What do I click here? Characterized borders leadership. Oh, a difficult one. A lot of that is also dependent on what you see and how you view things. If you take something on a global scale, for instance, let's talk about immigration into Europe and the so-called migrant crisis. You typically have two kinds of responses to something like that. The one would be to say, okay, like what the German chancellor has done is to open borders and invite people in, because after all, we are all people, and if people are destitute and they need help, you need to take them in. It's almost like a humanitarian duty that we have to show that level of respect and assistance to those who have less than what we have. But it is an approach. The other one would be to increase borders. In other words, to try and keep people out. If you look at some of the more conservative clawbacks of some political parties, specifically in the EU, you'll see that they are confronting this possible change. They're confronting that so-called paralysis by increasing borders. Other people are managing it by breaking the border down. But personally, from my experience, if I can answer that out of practice, what I have found is that leaders that are more exposed to work in a multicultural environment, in other words, they have more experience in working in a multicultural environment, tend to have a better ability to overcome this paralysis. Hope I've answered the question.
Another one for you is, what's an example of service leadership? Can you share a case study from recent organizational changes?
Example of service leadership.
Yes.
Yeah, it's not a recorded. It's not a recorded case study. As a matter of fact, we are busy. I'm about 18 months into the research of this, but I can share it with you so long. Whereby we opened a retail chain in Nigeria. This is a retail chain that is pretty strong in South Africa. They are also operating in a number of other African countries, but they found the Nigerian market, despite the fact that it's a large market and it's very promising and holds a lot of potential, they found it incredibly difficult to penetrate. They seemingly kept on getting the market research wrong. And one of the things that they did was to do quite a lot of research on how the local family and community structures work. What is the kind of culture that you find in the local community where they were attempting to penetrate the market? And what they found is that the elder part of the community, because they couldn't necessarily work anymore, they would be cared for by the working generation of the community, and more specifically let's say the middle. So if I can talk 3 generations, I have a grandfather, I have a father, and I have a son. But what ended up happening in this community was that when the father worked and had to provide and also take care of his own father, a lot of times the children were neglected in terms of proper care during the course of the day. Now, this happened both for grandfathers, grandmothers, fathers, mothers. It wasn't necessarily specific to a specific gender. But that's the way in which the community worked. And they then decided amongst themselves that the elders will keep on serving the community by taking care of the youngsters. So you had the middle generation earning the income, and the older generation, because they're being cared for, they would then care for the younger generation. So it was quite interesting what they did in the organization after they struggled to enter the market, is they implemented this model of service leadership in the retail organization, where you found that the manager, no manager, for instance, in the retailer are allowed to have an office. All managers needs to be on the floor and perform certain activities that is seen as service to someone that seemingly reports to them. So the manager would be on the floor. The manager will assist at the toll point, for instance, if there's assistance that's needed there. The manager would, if there's a shortage of a certain textile clothing on the shelf, the manager will assist the merchandiser to make sure that the proper clothing or the right number of shoe or whatever is on the shelf. And it was not done, the whole thing was to focus on the approach. It was not done in a supervisory context. It was done in a service context, where, yes, you have your line of reporting, but you have a more senior person that literally in store performs a service to some of these subordinates. And they did it in the community, with starting to employ, after training, of course, some of the local community members in the village, and had huge successes because of that. So that is one of the most recent practical case studies that we are working on, but stems from practice. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Dr. Sten, for your time and such a fascinating presentation.